Well, thank you for having me. It's an absolute honor, and it's always a thrill to talk with people about forgiveness. It's been the topic and interest um, that I have pursued for the last 20 years with great passion. Um, I am just delighted to be here sharing with you a little bit about what I know. And as you can see from the title slide, I'm really interested in how forgiveness and its benefits are manifest in our physical and mental and social well-being. Tonight, I will focus on a little bit of each of those areas, but probably more so on our physical well-being. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to some conversation and some questions afterwards. So I do a lot of work on forgiveness from a scientific perspective, and I know many of you are probably not scientists. So I'm gonna take some liberties and just kind of fast forward through some of the science details. And those of you that might have questions can certainly ask me for follow-up details later on, or I'm always happy to email with people, however you might like to do that. So let me get started here, and I'll say this. We have a problem, and that problem is that we experience unforgiveness. And unforgiveness is kind of a strange term. Sometimes people don't quite get it. They know the word forgiveness, but they don't really know much what the word unforgiveness means. And so a few years back, Dr. Worthington, myself, and some other colleagues decided to define this term. And we think of it as being kind of an emotional and motivational thing that you have towards someone who hurts you. And we oftentimes refer to that person as an offender, someone who offended you in some way. You have maybe some negative emotions toward them. You maybe want to get back at them in some way. You want to kind of hurt them back if that's possible. And so that's kind of the topic or the term unforgiveness. It's that kind of nasty desire to want to, even the scales again, get back at somebody, maybe describe some of the really nasty, negative, emotional tone that you might have. And the reason we have this unforgiveness is simple, really. I mean, we're not perfect people. We're not perfect creatures, and our society is not a perfect one. So while we are social creatures and we interact with everybody on a everyday basis, at least we used to before the pandemic. That's been limited a little bit, but we interact with each other often, and unfortunately, we hurt each other and we hurt ourselves, and as a result, we end up feeling kind of unforgiving about things. And that leaves us in kind of a pitiful state, really. The problem with unforgiveness really is not that we have it so much, it's what it brings up in us. If you could feel unforgiveness in kind of a cold, unemotional way, it probably wouldn't be such a problem. If it was just a perspective, a kind of a view on life, it maybe wouldn't be such a problem. But because it brings about all these negative emotions, it's troubling for us. And that's because negative emotions are connected to our psychological well-being, and we don't do well in our head when we have negative emotions floating around within us. We don't do well behaviorally when we have negative emotions. And if you think about that for a second, when you really feel angry towards someone, that's sometimes the times when we act in ways that are not very good. And for somebody like myself who bicycles to and from work, when someone cuts me off rudely in traffic because I'm moving too slow for them, Those are times when I maybe don't react as I'd like to. And so negative emotions have a behavioral influence, and they can kind of threaten our well-being because we do things, when we're angry with someone that we wouldn't otherwise do. Negative emotions change the way that we think often, and they cloud our vision, and they kind of narrow our focus often. And so when we could maybe think of other alternatives and ways of solving a problem, we don't, because we're being influenced by these negative emotions. Negative emotions also have what we call psychoendocrine responses or connections. And that is to say, oftentimes we think of negative emotions as being kind of a psychological experience, but anything psychological in that way is also an endocrinological experience. That means that emotions impact our hormones, and our hormones obviously impact the functioning of our physical body and our physical well-being. Negative emotions also impact what we call psychophysiological responses. And that's a big, long word, but let me boil it down for you. Psychophysiology is really just the reaction of your physiological system, your biological system, that can be measured from the surface of your skin. That is, we don't have to do anything invasive to see this. A really good example would be blood pressure. When you get really angry with somebody, your blood pressure goes up. It's one of the most reliable things we can find in this area, is that anger is tied to increased blood pressure. Now, it also increases your heart rate. It also disrupts your breathing. So your kind of breathing rate becomes sort of irregular and not a typical relaxed breathing rate. And so in addition to all of these things, negative emotions have a rather negative impact on our social well-being as well. So the problem here really begins with the fact that we're imperfect. We hurt ourselves and we hurt other people, and as a result, we feel kind of unforgiving, either toward ourselves or toward other people. It doesn't really matter what the target is. If you're feeling unforgiving, you're probably experiencing some negative emotions, and those negative emotions have a really broad array of effects. Well, the answer then, of course, to this is the concept of forgiveness. How do we fix unforgiveness? Well, hopefully we can douse it. We can douse the flames of unforgiveness with forgiveness. And so we need to think a little bit about what that is. Well, I think we commonly, and when I say we, I think of people in psychology and ministry, we think of forgiveness as being a letting go, a releasing of the negative affect, the negative beliefs, the negative behaviors that we might be tempted to engage in when someone has offended us. So letting go of the negative stuff. But frankly, especially when it comes to close relationships, we'd like to do more than just let go of the negative things. In other words, if my wife offends me, I want to do more than just say I don't hate her anymore. That wouldn't be a very good marital relationship if all I could say is, well, I don't hate my wife. I mean, that's not what we're aiming for. So typically in forgiveness, we're looking for more, not only letting go of the negative stuff, but replacing it with more positive stuff. So things like positive affects, positive emotions, positive beliefs or motivations. I want to do well for my wife. I want to act in kind and loving ways. Also, keep in mind, I've mentioned that forgiveness can be toward other people or it can be toward yourself. Those are two of the more widely studied areas in forgiveness today. Thinking about, how to get past people that have hurt you, or thinking about how to get past times that you've hurt yourself. It can be a trait, and it can also be a state. So we think of, forgiving people, and we'll see a couple of those examples later. But we also think of just like, being in a forgiving moment, being able to forgive someone and experiencing, really feeling that the blissfulness of forgiveness. And then finally, I'd say that forgiveness, although I've talked about it a lot as an emotion, it is also very clearly a decision, kind of a cognitive, rational decision. And so We think of forgiveness often as something that benefits us when we feel it, but often to get there, we have to make a decision to go there. And so that's a key aspect of forgiveness. Well, we can think of lots of examples, and those of you in South Africa, you know, really good examples of forgiveness, but there are others, and you need only to do a quick Google search and search examples of forgiveness, and you'll find them to be plentiful. And I often think it's very important that we hold out examples of forgiveness. Those of you that are Christian will think of Jesus Christ as the example of forgiveness. Sometimes it's easy to think that we're somehow broken beyond the ability to forgive, but when you look at other examples of forgiveness, you see regular, everyday people who are doing this and doing it well, and that means that there is hope for even those of us that feel like we're hopeless, that there is no way we're going to be able to forgive. If other people have been able to do it in circumstances that have been exceptionally dire, then we can probably do it. We're really no different than those other folks around us. I'll say a couple quick things about forgiveness. One is there's lots of misconceptions about forgiveness. And so I want to start by saying I think of forgiveness in this way. Forgiveness is all of these positive things. It's peacefulness, perhaps the strongest example of love. It is not something that is weak. It's really something that's only to be entered into by the strong, because forgiveness will challenge you. You really have to want it. And so, if you're a forgiving person, you're a strong person, you're a responsible person, you're someone who's taking responsibility for your own healing. And it's a great sense of calm that comes over you when you're forgiven. What it is not condoning violence. It's not condoning misconduct in any way, saying that it's just okay. It's not forgiving. In America, I don't know if you have this adage in South Africa, but in America we have a phrase we say, forgive and forget. And I would say that does us a lot of harm. I think it's much better to say forgive, but remember. And we can get into some reasons for that later. But it's very important to not forget about someone who has done you wrong, because they might do you wrong again in the future, and you want to be maybe ready for that. You don't want to excuse wrongdoing. You don't want to excuse violence or harm. That's not what forgiveness is. It's in fact recognizing that and yet still being able to forgive it. Same thing with denying. We're not denying that someone was hurt, or we're not minimizing or dismissing someone's pain. We're doing all of these things in the reverse. We're not condoning it. We're not excusing it. We're not denying it. And yet we're still saying we're going to try to forgive it. And so that's key. And then finally, it's not reconciling. You're not saying necessarily that you want to get back together with this person. You're not necessarily advocating that somebody should be good friends with someone who's hurt them. But we're simply saying that you don't have to carry around the burden of unforgiveness for a lifetime just because you don't want to, reconcile with them. The final thing that's often most confused with forgiveness is the notion of justice. And so I want to just do a little diagram here that I think helps with that. Easily conceived of as the notion that you could be not at all forgiving on the left-hand side, or you could be completely forgiving on the right-hand side. You could also understand in a separate, very clearly distinct way, you could be someone who experiences absolutely no justice. For whatever reason, there is no reckoning. There is no righting of the wrong. There is no justice. Or you could be someone who experiences complete justice. And whatever was, done wrong to you, it was almost 100% fixed by your social or legal system of justice. So oftentimes people glue these things together. They put them together in ways that just don't really hold true. They say justice and forgiveness are kind of hand in hand. They go hand in hand. And I would say, okay, I can understand why sometimes people think that. But you know what? That means that if there is no justice, then someone cannot be forgiven. And that's probably not true. People have, in fact, done that. People have also done something, but it doesn't get as much attention often. That is, they get justice. The wrong is righted, but they cannot forgive. And as I mentioned just a second ago, sometimes people get no justice, but they are still able to forgive. And again, you can look for examples of these things and you will find them. It's clear to me that forgiveness and justice, while they might be connected in some loose way, they are not one and the same, and one does not require the other. Having said that, I will add that sometimes getting justice, if it makes you feel safe and secure, if you're no longer under the threat of further harm, it might facilitate forgiveness. And so while they, can go together in some ways, one can help the other, they are not the same thing. So having spent a few minutes thinking about forgiveness, which is incredibly important for us to do because there are so very many misconceptions, I want to think just a short bit about what health is, because that's one of the things that's kind of the main thing that we want to talk about today. Is one of the main benefits of forgiving is that it does your physical health good. But the World Health Organization has a definition of health, and their definition is a broad one. They say it is the complete presence of physical, mental, and social well-being. So as we go here today, you'll see elements of these three different aspects of health in my presentation. I'm going to tend to emphasize and highlight more the physical side of it, as I said, but we will talk a little bit about these other aspects of health, because health is a very, very broad topic, and I think it would be wrong to say that health is just physical health. So, but my good friend and colleague tomorrow, Dr. John Webb, is going to dive deeper on forgiveness and mental health, and so I don't want to take too much time with that. I'll just reference it in a couple of places. So I want to start you thinking about an idea, and that is that forgiveness can actually be protective for you. You think about lots of things that can protect you, and maybe some of you take multivitamins because you heard that it protects your health. Or maybe some of you exercise, and you exercise regularly, and you do that because it protects your health. Some of you might pray, or you might meditate, and you do that in some way because it protects your spirit or your soul, your spirituality, your spiritual well-being, or in some cases, that certain forms of meditation or prayer protect your health. And so in that same sense, I want you to think about the notion that forgiveness could be a protective factor for you in your life. It could be something that offers you a bit of a shield, if you will, against the stresses of life that confront you. So I'm going to give you a complicated picture, and we're not going to spend much time on this because it is rather complicated, but I'm going to say you see lots of boxes and lots of arrows on the screen. All of this boils down to the notion that forgiveness or unforgiveness is connected to your health through many different mechanisms. And those mechanisms could be things like, at the bottom of the screen, you see a short list of things like hope or hopelessness, pessimism, healthy behavior, social support. You could imagine that someone who is really unforgiving about an incident could fall into a kind of pit of hopelessness. Or they might be so despairing that they just start to drink or smoke marijuana or whatever as an escape. And they engage in really unhealthy behaviors to try to escape the harm that's been done to them. And so you can see that, forgiveness and unforgiveness both could act through these different mechanisms. And that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about forgiveness, is that not only is it connected, as you can see, by the arrow labeled A and the arrow labeled F, it's connected directly to health and well-being. It's also connected to these things that kind of help you bring about even better well-being, because hopelessness has been tied to increased cancer risk and to poorer heart health. Likewise, pessimism has been tied to mortality and earlier death. And so forgiveness is connecting in kind of interesting ways, not just to the end outcome of health and well-being, but also to these other things that also facilitate your health and well-being. And so oftentimes we think of it in this way, that we're thinking about not only how is forgiveness related to health, but what are the mechanisms by which forgiveness is tied to health. And that's a really interesting, from a scientific perspective, but also really applicable thing to ask, because you might want to know, like, what are the things what are the side effects of forgiveness that are also beneficial to my health? If you think about exercise, it's beneficial to your health for lots of reasons. It brings your stress level down. It tends to typically bring your heart rate and blood pressure down. It increases the efficiency and the functioning of many of your organs, like your respiration and metabolism, and all of these things change. Cell metabolism is improved. I mean, all of these things are side effects of of exercise that have a kind of a mechanistic impact on your ultimate physical health. So I'm going to highlight some studies here and highlight them quickly to say a few things about health. One, when we look at life stress, often we find very negative effects of life stress on mental and physical health. And we were curious a few years ago about what the effects of forgiveness were in terms of its direct connection, like I said earlier, to physical and mental health, and its protective effect on the relationship between stress and mental health and physical health. And what we found is what you might expect. We found that stress was related to poorer health. Forgiveness was related to better health, both mental and physical in both cases. But then we found a really interesting thing. And this is kind of a complicated picture, but I'm going to try to simplify it for you. If you look at the red line shows a correlation that as you go from low to high stress, you go from low to higher mental illness symptoms. And that's the typical relationship between stress and mental illness. You say, boy, the more stress I'm under, the worse my mental health is. But look at those colors of those lines. The dotted line in the middle represents people who are moderately forgiving. And the blue dashed line represents people who are highly forgiving. And I'm going to focus on the blue dashed line because it shows that the people who are highly forgiving have virtually and statistically speaking, a zero correlation between stress and poor mental health. The correlation between stress and poor mental health is generally like 0.6 to 0.8 on a scale of 0 to 1. So it's usually a really large and robust relationship. We find it everywhere. But if you're a highly forgiving person, that relationship is gone. It's not there anymore. So this got us thinking, could forgiveness be protective in other realms? So a second study, this time we examined stress, depression, shame, and guilt as predictors of suicidality, because all of these things tend to make people's risk of suicide go up. Well, what did we find when we looked at this? It's the same pattern, that if you're someone who has low self-forgiveness, now, this is not forgiving others, but this is self-forgiveness. If you have low self-forgiveness, then if you're stressed out, it leads you to greater likelihood of being suicidal. But if you have average self-forgiveness, it brings that risk down. And if you have high self-forgiveness, it brings that risk down even further. And that holds not only for stress, but depression. If you think about depression, depression is a strong predictor of suicidality. But that risk of being suicidal, if you're depressed, gets moderated or buffered, or it gets reduced, it gets shrunk by being a more self-forgiving person. And that's true for people who feel shameful about themselves. It's true for people who feel guilty about themselves. And so we got that same kind of relationship, that there's a strong relationship between these predictors: stress, depression, shame, and guilt. They all make suicidality go up, but not if you're a highly self-forgiving person. And so I wanted to see, how far could we stretch this, right? Is this really what we think is a real phenomenon here? Is this really going on in ways that are real and meaningful? And so we looked at one other thing. We said, let's look at this self-forgiveness thing, and let's look at not only self-forgiveness, but forgiveness of others, and what's kind of known as a hostile outlook. Hostile people, they tend to do things that they regret later. They lash out at people. They kind of, they bark at people and yell at them, and kind of, they're very distrusting. They're not very easy people to be around. Kind of cynical, always, asking questions and second guessing folks. And we know that kind of negative emotionality is going to have impact, but we took this to kind of an extreme. We said, I wonder if it would impact your cognitive health, your brain health, the ability of your brain to work well and to function well cognitively. And we looked at this across 10 years. In older adults, we followed this for 10 years, and we found, sure enough, that as people got older across a decade's time, the people that were more hostile, they got less and less efficient in their cognitive functioning across time. They got less efficient more rapidly, in fact. The people that were less hostile, they still, your cognitive functioning starts to slow as you get older. That's natural. But the people that were really hostile, it kind of accelerated it. And so we thought, well, this is not good, right? This is not what we'd like to see. I wonder if forgiveness, because when you're a hostile person, you do things that you later regret. You bark at people, you snap at them. I wonder if being a self-forgiving person would protect you in kind of the same ways that it did in other realms, in terms of like general physical and mental health, suicidality. Is your cognitive health protected? And sure enough, this same picture showed up again, that people that were the most highly self-forgiving people, it erased that connection between hostility and the rate of cognitive decline over time. It's not even a statistically reliable relationship, where it is for people who are even just moderately self-forgiving, and especially for people who are the blue line on this graph, people that are not self-forgiving at all. They're very low on that. Boy, the influence of the negative emotionality of being hostile, it really accelerates the rate of cognitive decline over time. And so we kind of come to this conclusion that forgiveness is something that it's not only directly connected, but it is also something that protects you against negative emotionality in general in life, whether it be stress or hostility or shamefulness or general depression. It really helps to buffer you against the ravages of all that negative emotional content in your life. So we got, continued to get interested in this, and I wanted to be sure to highlight a couple things here today about its direct connection to physical health and physical health outcomes. We all want to enjoy good physical health, especially as we get older in life, and physical health becomes more of a problem. So we launched a study, and we looked at in adults over the age of 65, so older adults. We simply wanted to ask the question, is being an unforgiving person, we suspect that that's going to be related to more stress and more of all this kind of negative emotional content. But is that really going to take a toll on your physical health? One thing to say that it might impact your cognitive functioning later on, or maybe you're not at great suicide risk to begin with. But, in terms, everybody's going to experience some physical health challenges as you get older. And we wanted to know, would this be a potential issue, being unforgiving? And so sure enough, we have another picture here. The connection here of greatest interest is from unforgiveness at time 1 to poor physical health at time 2. Time 1 and time 2 are separated by 3 entire years. So older adults who are unforgiving 3 years later experienced less of quality of physical health. They had an impaired physical health quality of life. And the other boxes and arrows on this screen do a couple things for us. One, they eliminate the possibility that unforgiveness at time 1 could just be the result of being in poor health already at time 1. Because when you're not feeling well physically, it's maybe not as easy to forgive other people, because you're kind of grumpy. You're maybe in pain, you're hurting, you're not feeling very well, and you might just be more unforgiving by nature already. And so you might say that just, essentially, if you're in poor health to begin with, you're going to be in poorer health 3 years later, and you're going to be more unforgiving. But that's not true here. We were able to rule that out statistically speaking. And so there's a very clear linkage and connection between being unforgiving and experiencing poor health. So this led me to one last question that I want to share with you today. And that is, if you take this to the extreme, right, you're looking at the influences of forgiveness and unforgiveness on our overall physical well-being, things like our tendencies towards suicidality, and the more suicidal you are, the more likely you're going to live a shorter life, right? And you're thinking about cognitive function. In America today, we have a really big problem we're facing with a really aging population. And if things like negative emotionality cause you to have a greater rate of cognitive decline, that's not good. Dementias are on the rise. That's troubling. But ultimately, all of these things are things that might impair our quality of life, but do they shorten it? In the end, we might all be interested most in whether or not we live a long and fruitful life. That's the thing that we're maybe all after, right? We'd like to live a long and healthy life. And so one last question was the final study that I want to share with you was motivated by that question. Is it possible that forgiveness is connected to death, to earlier death or longer life, however you want to put it? And then could we understand why? That was the second question. Is it possible to understand why that might be? So we looked at a model that looks like this. We said we think forgiveness probably, given what we know, probably leads to an impact on physical health. It probably impacts our kind of psychosocial experience, our mental health and other social variables, and it probably is impacting our religious and spiritual experience. And so we tied this all together in a statistical model where the endpoint was simply mortality or death, early death. And again, this was a study of older adults, followed people for 3 years. The folks that were more forgiving were about 30% more likely to still be alive 3 years later. So depending on how you say that, you might say it's a 30% reduction in the risk of death over 3 years span of time. And when we looked at these 3 different pathways through which that effect might be had, we found that it was mainly through physical health. The connection to mortality was that more forgiving people were in better health, and being in better health puts you at less risk of dying. So kind of a, no kidding kind of thing, but it hadn't been established scientifically. And so we did that and showed that, the benefit of forgiveness is that it puts you in a better state of health. The benefit of being in a better state of health is that you live longer. So so that was kind of at this point, that kind of brings me to the conclusion here, which is, forgiveness is good in the short term, impacts all kinds of good health outcomes, and it's also very good in the long term. To summarize, in general, I might say people that have low levels of forgiveness, they have lots of trouble with negative emotions through life. Medium levels probably still have some troubles, but for people with high levels of forgiveness, guess what? I call it, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I call it my magic eraser, because that's what it does. It disconnects you from the ramifications, the consequences of negative emotions. And so I want to conclude here with a couple things to say. Once people hear this, forgiveness is related to better health. Well, that's great, but how do I become a more forgiving person? Good question. Well, if you want to be a more forgiving person, there's no better model than I know of than my friend and colleague Everett Worthington, who you've heard from, who developed the REACH model. And I'm sure if you haven't heard about it already, you will hear about it across the course of your sessions here. It stands for remember, empathize, give an altruistic gift of forgiveness, commit, hold on, and then overcome. Anytime you see unforgiveness creeping back into your life, you try to cycle back through and do your best to improve in terms of forgiveness. Now, the REACH forgiveness model is something that I've tested with Dr. Worthington and others. It is a scientifically validated approach to helping people forgive, and it is probably one of 2 or 3 approaches that have been really rigorously scientifically evaluated. And the great thing about Dr. Worthington's model is very simple. It has a really nice, handy acronym, right? That if you want to become a more forgiving person, well, all you need to do is reach for it. You got, like anything in life that you want, you gotta stretch, you gotta work hard. It's probably gonna make you want it, and you got to reach for forgiveness. I would argue that forgiveness, like any other aspect of health and wellness, is something that you have to work at daily. You have to work and work and work and work. Every time I think I've succeeded in some way in forgiving, I'm challenged by it again, either in a different aspect of life or by the same thing that kind of comes back to me. And I thought I had it. I thought I had it figured out. Turns out I don't. I'm still struggling with it. So if you want to be a more fit and healthy person, what do? You pump that iron, you work hard, you're out doing your runs, your walks, your hikes, your bikes, your cross country skiing, I suppose now this time of year for you all. But you gotta work hard at this thing, and you gotta make it a part of your daily experience. How do you do that? Well, I said that one of the best things about the Reach model is that it's very available. If you go to Everett Worthington's website, you'll find plentiful resources. One of my favorites is the do-it-yourself materials that he has online. He has do-it-yourself guides for just about everything you can think of in terms of forgiveness. If you need it and it's not there, I would suspect you're not looking hard enough, right? It's a treasure trove of resources for forgiveness. You do it yourself. You download these things. It doesn't have to be something that's done with a counselor or a preacher or a teacher. You can do it yourself. And a lot of the workbooks that Dr. Worthington has available are very reasonable. They don't require hours upon hours or days upon days. Some of them can be done in a couple hours. And if you're like me, you pick up something, it's going to take you a couple hours to read through and work through. You do 5-10 minutes of it a day. It's about all I have for time to commit to it sometimes. But it works out pretty good. 5-10 minutes a day for 5 or 6 days, and you've done half the work, right? A couple weeks, and you've done some of this work. Is it gonna just fix everything? Probably not. You probably need to work on it, and like I said, work on it again and again and again and again. But very effective, scientifically supported materials. I put forgiveness at the nexus of many of the different aspects of the World Health Organization's definition of health. And if you want more information about forgiveness and health in particular, Dr. Worthington and I and my good colleague, Dr. David R. Williams at Harvard University, we edited a collection of works on forgiveness and health. And so if you want or need more information in that regard, by all means, you can find it there, or you can simply be in touch with me. And in order to do that, perhaps the easiest thing to do would be to email me. I don't know what your availability is to phone me, but you might decide to do that. The background images here are of my lovely little small town. Decorah, Iowa is here. So you're all welcome to make a visit. Just let me know when you're coming. And let me end by saying thank you. This, as I said when I started out, is the absolute delight of my life to speak of and help other people learn about forgiveness. So I'm going to end it there and ask if there are questions. We can certainly take it. Sean, would you like me to stop sharing my screen?
Yes, I think that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Loren.
yeah.
That's great. And wow, I must say I am bowled over. I'm bowled over. There's just so much to absorb in the chat, some of them to me personally, just saying this is so good and where can we get hold of it and will this be recorded and uploaded? And I'm saying yes, yes, yes. So thank you so much, Loren. I do have some questions in the chat. Would you prefer to read to them yourself? Would you like me to moderate where I ask the question and you respond?
Let me see here. I got my chat window up. You want me to take it from the top?
Yes, it was after that one. Forgiveness has a huge influence in our lives. So the first question is, if one is naturally unforgiving person, how do they change? So take it from there.
Okay. Let me. Yeah. Right. If they don't exhibit trait forgiveness, yeah, that's a really great question. And I would say a change always begins with a decision. It always begins with a strong intention to commit and to do the work. Now, if somebody's not very inclined toward forgiveness, maybe they're kind of naturally hostile in their disposition, it's perfectly fine. There are those of us that aren't very skilled athletically. It doesn't mean that I can't, sign up at the gym and start working out. My gains may come harder, they may come slower. Um, and there's always a possibility that I just may not see any. And that's the truth with forgiveness and with so many different aspects of life. But the I think the worst possible outcome would be to never try. One thing that we know from the forgiveness literature on forgiveness interventions is that the number one thing is to spend time trying, spend time thinking and working on forgiveness. There is a statistical linear relationship between the amount of time you invest and the amount of benefit you get out of forgiveness work. And that's true for all kinds of things. When you look at, there was a few years ago a big review and meta-analysis of studies of weight loss, and the question was, what is the best weight loss strategy? And the answer was the one that you will do and stick to. And there was no people were thinking, oh, we'll find, one strategy is much better and it allows you to lose 25 pounds of weight instead of 5. That wasn't true. They were all about equally effective in helping people to lose weight. But if you don't do it, if you don't try it, you're not going to lose weight, right? And the same thing is true here. I really empathize with that question. Sometimes they say scientists study the things that they can't control, and that I might be a good example of that, right? I really struggle sometimes with forgiveness, and I'm not very inclined toward it. It just doesn't come naturally to me. And it does seem like it does for others. My wife will, something will happen, we'll be offended by something, and she'll just easily dismiss it and kind of lose all the emotional negativity about it. And I a couple days later, I'm asking, seriously, you're just over it? And her answer is simply, yeah, right. But it doesn't mean that we can't try, and we have to try.
Well, that's very encouraging for those of us who are naturally skilled in hostility. Thank you, Loren. That gives us hope. Okay, the next question was, what does it look like to forgive and not forget? And why would one want to do that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't want to forget people who hurt me. I don't want to forget the things that they did. I don't want to forget who did hurt me. But I'm not going to get wrapped up in the memory of the hurt. I might think about filing it as kind of an objective note. Not that I want to sit around making a log book of everybody who's ever hurt me, but I might mentally keep track of someone who hurt me in an important way, but only to just use it as a signal, maybe to remember, hey, I'm still dealing with this person at work. They really hurt me bad, a few years back. I want to just be careful. I want to protect myself here. I don't want to go in and naively be hurt again. But I don't have that memory. I'm not remembering it with a sort of vengeance and deep-seated negativity that I once did. A couple days after they hurt me, ooh, boy, I was just seething, right? And I'm not doing that anymore. I'm just making a kind of a mental note to say, let's be careful around this person. I just don't want to be hurt again. And I think that's active and adaptive coping that allows you to hopefully circumvent having to forgive again in the future. The last thing that I want to do is encourage people to be hurt and then forgive, and then to be hurt again repeatedly and to have to continue to struggle to forgive repeated offenses, when maybe there's a better strategy of problem solving. Maybe there's a better way to get around this to avoid being hurt in the first place. So that's my thought on forgiving but remembering. Don't forgive and remember in a deeply emotional way. Hopefully, you can let the deeply emotional negativity go, but just hold an objective, sort of cold, emotionless bookmark to say, I want to be careful. This person has hurt me bad before.
Okay, that sounds very good. Another question is, if one reduces hostility, will cognitive function improve? In other words, if unforgiveness has already created such a negative health outcome in your cognitive function, by forgiving over time, will it improve cognitive function? Similar to when someone stops smoking and immediately they see some recovery to the body.
Yeah, I think what our data can support here is to say that um, when you reduce people who have lower levels of hostility, who reduce their hostility, will enjoy better cognitive function. But I think I have to stop short of saying that reducing hostility will repair cognitive function.
Okay.
When someone stops smoking, there are organic processes that start to repair the damage that was done almost immediately. I don't know that we can say that here. What I can say is that if you can reduce your hostility, you're going to enjoy better cognitive function. But if you've been really hostile for 30 years, I don't know that we can repair that. I can't say that forgiveness can help you repair that at this point.
Okay.
That is a fantastic question. And one that makes the wheels turn wildly about what kinds of data I might have that would be available to answer that question.
Yes, well, that would be very interesting to consider that for the future.
Yeah, absolutely, most certainly.
Another question we have are, what are the factors that place you in the low, middle, or high forgiveness state?
I'm sorry, I missed that first part, Sean.
What are the factors that place you in the low, middle, or high forgiveness state? So what are the things that contribute to affect you and put you into that low, middle, or high forgiveness state?
Yeah, right. Well, I think we can probably name several of them if we just, even if we just brainstormed. I don't really need to brainstorm, but you would you would probably hit quickly on things like people's philosophy of life, their morals, their religious background, their personality, if they're tend to be kind of a forgiving person to begin with. Whether or not someone has received an apology, whether or not the individual is close to you or not, because we tend to forgive people who are close to us more readily, more quickly. All kinds of things that kind of have a social and interpersonal flavor, as well as kind of religious and spiritual variables, philosophical, morals, ethics, those kinds of things. All of these things, if you sat down and made a list and said, what is it? What happens when I forgive someone? What kind of facilitates that? You'd probably hit on these things. But the interesting thing is that research has shown in almost all of these cases that these things are contributors to whether people hit the middle, fall low, or actually achieve the higher levels of forgiveness.
So
Really
there
good
are
question.
variables that come into play. It's not just a simple answer.
Yeah, right. I've named some of the things that have been researched and have that there's evidence of, but I certainly haven't hit all of them. Yeah, it's complex, very complex equation. I didn't even really touch on things like sociocultural variables. In some cultures and in some communities, forgiveness is a given. It's not an option. In some cultures and faith communities, it is a given that it will not be offered unless the appropriate requirements have been met. So things like those kind of macro level variables I didn't really even get into. So yeah, very complicated question.
Yes. Someone's asked, can self-unforgiveness cause illness such as cancer? So looking at self-unforgiveness, can it have a physiological effect on a person?
Yeah, so a couple of things to say there. One, that is another, I wish we had more time and an ability to interact in greater depth here, because all of you are asking these are just fantastic questions. Whether it be self-unforgiveness or forgiving others, we have looked at the relationship of those variables to cancer onset. And there are some sketchy connections that I would hesitate to even get into too much depth on. The bottom line with forgiveness and cancer is that it's like any other psychosocial variable in cancer, we don't know. And if we knew what caused cancer, and if it was forgiveness, I would be probably a very rich man, right? I mean, we just have cancer affects way too many people in this world, and if you had the answer to solving it, and I don't mean to, I don't mean to reduce the question too much. I know you're not asking naively. Of course, it doesn't cause it, it doesn't fix it, but there are some hints, I'll say at this point, that it might be involved. And a few years ago, a good colleague of mine and I did do a self-forgiveness intervention in cancer survivors who were very late stage cancer survivors. And we did find that forgiving themselves improved their psychological and their kind of emotional quality of life in significant ways. We did not examine biological endpoints of cancer function at that point because they were at very late stages of cancer. Their biology was in such a hurricane of disturbance that our oncologist collaborators told us it would be silly to try to make sense of it at this point. And so we didn't do that. Just because we were unable to. But one thing that we do know is that self-forgiveness in cancer patients facilitates their quality of life, and quality of life in cancer patients is a strong predictor of cancer outcomes. Cancer patients that are reporting a better quality of life, better emotional well-being, end up typically doing better in the future. They live a bit longer, and the progression of their disease is not quite as rapid. So there is kind of an interesting connection there between self-forgiveness and cancer. But I have to put the disclaimer on that to say nobody knows what causes cancer. There are a few biologics in the world and environmental toxins that we do know of that certainly do seem carcinogenic, but we don't know that about self-forgiveness.
Wow.
Great question though.
Yes, thank you. Toussaint, I've got a final question here. Does it have a greater influence if you have unforgiveness towards a primary relationship than other people? And I would take it because we talk about physical health now, but it would most probably also include mental and social health. But unforgiveness towards a primary person, has that got a greater effect in one's life?
Yeah, and the answer to that is most certainly, and the reason is that our primary relationships, close, intimate relationships that you have with family and friends, are a really strong part of social support. And if a good friend or a spouse or a family member offends you in a really deep way and you lose that part of your social support network, that is a disproportionately large piece of your social support pie. If it's an acquaintance, a neighbor that you talk to once a month and they offend you, you probably don't lose much of your support network. But if it's somebody who's really close, that's going to have a significant impact on your social support resources. Social support is it is the size of its impact on your physical health has been compared to and is roughly equivalent in some studies to the impact of stopping smoking. So the fact that forgiveness is obviously going to contribute in important ways to the maintenance of your social support network suggests that it's going to be central in repairing those close primary relationships, key parts of your social support network. And those key parts of social support are really tightly connected to physical health.
Wow, it seems like we as integrated beings, I think of the bio-psycho-social spiritual approach, that being such beings that when we are unforgiving, it affects all four of those areas of our lives: our bodies, our minds, our soul, our social interactions, our communities. And then also the same with unforgiveness or forgiveness affecting us negatively or positively. And last night, Professor Worthington said that his mission was to promote forgiveness in every willing heart, home, and homeland. And I'm thinking of the benefit of forgiveness. Just listening to you share tonight, I must be honest, I never knew that it was this pervasive, this extensive, this impactful in our lives. And so even for people of faith, if you're a Christian and you believe that God forgives and it's necessary, and you understand the spiritual implications, here we see that it affects all levels of life, micro, meso, and macro. And so thank you so much for sharing this tonight.